Hello, everyone, and welcome back. We are the Wobbly Historians. Hey, everyone. John Cannon here with Phil Craig and Mark Prue, and we are your guides and historians at Liberation Tours. And as always, we invite you to check us out at liberationtours.ca at the end of the webcast and find out what we're all about. Right, we're going to jump into a new series of videos now, dealing with the First World War, and in fact, the last month of the war. It's just around now, in 1918, that Canada was showing its amazing strength and resolve in what became known as Canada's 100 Days. Some amazing feats of arms occurred, a number of Victoria Crosses were earned as well, and today we're going to focus on the first little piece of that, and I'm going to kick it right over to Phil.
Yeah, and I want to add, following each webcast, you're going to see below the YouTube viewing box a list of the references from which our storylines have been developed. So if you're looking for further reading or research, you can do no better than start with that list. And by doing that, we want to fully acknowledge and thank those historian writers whose works we have, shamelessly scavenged and pieced together to bring to life the amazing tales you are about to hear. What you're looking at is the official Nicholson Map dealing with the Battle of Amiens, France, August 8th to 18th, 1918. To the left of the map is Amiens, and it was from Amiens in late summer 1918 that the first of the massive assaults on the German defensive line took place. Assault on the powerful German defensive line called the Hindenburg Line. On the 16th of March 1917, in an effort to shorten their lines, German troops began a withdrawal as part of Operation Alberic and retired 40 kilometers to a new, heavily fortified series of positions. And this was the Hindenburg Line. Broad belts of barbed wire entanglements were placed forward of the fortified positions to slow any Allied attack. Concrete fortifications were poured. Concrete reinforced with steel rods were designed and built to protect the troops from artillery bombardment and also to function as machine gun emplacements, observation posts, command posts, communication centers, and medical aid stations. Mobile field gun emplacements were dug, giving the guns a wide field of fire. And trench mortars were emplaced in simple pits with multiple positions being prepared so the guns could frequently move to alternative positions. And larger caliber indirect fire artillery was located well to the rear behind the second trench system, close enough to the front line so that the guns could concentrate fire on an Allied attack. Anti-aircraft guns were emplaced in simple earthworks with concrete shelters to house searchlights. Anti-tank obstacles consisting of ditches, barricades, and minefields were laid, some containing as many as 7,000 mines, and camouflage, canvas netting or cut vegetation, gun emplacements painted to look like normal buildings, and decoy trenches, dummy guns to draw fire. It was a formidable system, and the Allies knew that crashing it was not going to be easy, but they hoped that breaking this line would bring about finally an end to the First World War. So the initial assault happens here on a front roughly 40 kilometers wide. In the center, you can see Canadian Corps. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Divisions will lead off the attack, and the 4th Division will then move through to continue the assault. And in turn, the 1st, 2nd, 3rd Divs would move through them onto the objective. Now, to the north of us, the assault will be made by the Diggers and the Kiwis of Australia and New Zealand, and to the south, the French. And here, in the middle, the pivotal central thrust will be led by the Canucks, the Canadians. And there's a reason for this. At the Somme 2 years ago in 1916, the Anzacs, remember, they're fighting to the north of us, established a reputation for tough, hard fighting. And at the Somme, in the battles for Courcelette, Regina Trench, later in 1917, in the battles for Vimy Ridge and Hill 70 and Passchendaele, the Canadian Corps established itself as the elite fighting force of the war. Anywhere the Germans faced the Canadian Corps, they knew they were in for a very rough ride, and reinforcements would immediately be flooded into the defense. And of course, this reputation is going to continue in the Second War, when we're tasked with taking Juno Beach, the assault at Dieppe, the liberation of the Scheldt and Holland. So, on this ground, the responsibility of spearheading the attack falls to the Canadians. This monument, Le Canal Canadian Memorial, commemorates the achievements of the Canadian Corps in the Battle of Amiens from the 8th to the 11th of August 1918. You can read the inscription on the side. The Canadian Corps, 100,000 strong, on 8th of August 1918, attacked between Horg and Villa-Bretonneux and drove the enemy eastward for 8 miles. So what it says is true, but to fully understand, we need, as always, to go back. I mentioned Vimy Ridge, Hill 70, Passchendaele. These were massive hard-won victories in 1917. So the Canadians end the year 1917 with 3 important hard-won, as I say, victories. Vimy Ridge, Hill 70, Passchendaele, and the Allies almost pull off a stunning victory at Cambrai. But away from the battlefield, some very important events take place in the year 1917. By the end of 1917, the French mutinies. The men had basically refused to attack, and they bleated like sheep when their officers passed by, had been largely brought back under control with promises of more home leave, better food, and a higher daily ration of wine, which we'll be talking about later. America had entered the war in April 1917 as a result of Germany's resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare on all vessels that enter the war zone they had declared around Great Britain, and also because of the revelation of the Zimmermann telegram, which explicitly invited Mexico to join the war on the Axis side. And so by late 1917, America was sending 10,000 fresh soldiers to France every day. But most importantly, there was a revolution in Russia, and she dropped out of the war. And so this released large numbers of German troops from the east. Well over 500,000 men suddenly become available for use in the west. And with German reinforcements and new American troops pouring in, it becomes clear that the outcome will be decided here on the Western Front. And so Carl is going to update us on German thinking at that time. Over to you, Carl.
Thank you, Phil. The map that Phil had showed pretty much outlines the positions quite well and shows the disposition of the German forces facing, the Canadians and the Entente powers. So just to provide some background leading up to this battle and the reversals of fortune, on the Western Front and, the culmination of 4.5, almost 4 years of war, let's understand that German situation. So the Germans realized this is really the last opportunity for the OHL, or the Oberste Heeresleitung, which is the German High Command, as well as the KUK, which is the Kaiserlich und Königlich Austro-Hungarian Command. So they realize to achieve victory, even a Pyrrhic one, with mounting social pressures at home, unrest in Germany, the opportunity afforded by the Russian Revolution, that this is the time to strike. So we're going back to understand that Germany is going to mount its largest offensive of the war in an attempt to win and force the issue in the West, where, as Phil mentioned, this will be decided. But back home in Germany, a typical, for the first 3 years, a compliant, supportive population is now starting to question the leadership. There's protests in the streets over food shortages, a stagnant war that has cost to this point approximately 1.9 million casualties. And this is forcing the Germans and the central commands to attempt this last-ditch offensive in the hopes, again, of regaining the initiative, defeating the Western forces, or at least getting more favorable peace. The end of the war in the East with the Brest-Litovsk Treaty will allow some 40 to 50 German divisions to be transferred to the West. Now, that's an incredible amount of men, almost 700,000 troops, brought into the Western Front to face the Entente powers. Now, more importantly, I in the research, I understand that almost 700,000 men were also kept in the East. So I think that's interesting to understand what those numbers could have meant in terms of the balance of power in the West. And could that be the tipping point? One of those questions we'll never know as we look back in history. So the Germans will launch what is called the Kaiserschlacht, or the Spring Offensive, in March 1918, the first of a series of attacks to outflank the British. And then once they've kind of realized defeat is inevitable, it'll cause the French to retire as well. Everyone will sue for peace, and Germany will have the victory. That's assuming an awful lot goes well, and that's not taking into account, obviously, as Phil's talked about, the Canadian factor, which is proving to be the definitive factor in the war at this point. So the German plan will focus on British sectors, as they believe these to be the easier opponents. That's not to disparage British troops. That's the German thinking at the time. They did not want to hit the French lines or the Canadian lines. They wanted to go after the British. However, they'll still hit other lines because they want to prevent the resumption or the transfer of reinforcements away from those sectors to supporting the British. The battles will highlight the use of storm troops, or Stoßtruppen, which Phil will touch on a bit more, but these were specially trained troops, highly skilled in infiltration tactics, the coordination of specialized weapons, and movement, rapid, skilled movement. That, I guess, is almost a precursor to some of the blitzkrieg that may happen later in the war, but I'm sure that it's not a strong connection. So stormtroops are first suggested by a French officer, Lafargue, in 1915. And it's the Canadians who actually use these techniques first. The Germans had developed similar techniques earlier, but it's really the Canadians that hone and refine it, and then the Germans pick up on the value and the importance of this. So the breakthroughs, reset. The breakthroughs by these stormtroops would be exploited by follow-on units. The breach would be widened, the momentum maintained. The Germans recovered much of the ground they'd lost in the preceding years. It was an incredible, effort, land retaken, the Entente powers caught by surprise, and by August, the momentum really starts to wane. Things start to slow down, and the German command realizes that it's switched back to the Entente powers. And at this point, the loss in men, material, is proving to be overwhelming, and they can't sustain this to the objectives that they had hoped for. So there'll be additional offensives such as Gneisenau, Blucher York, Georgette. They'll be launched, but they won't achieve any of the objectives outlined for them, and the costly losses will really seal the end of it. So let's not underestimate the staunch British, Canadian, French defenses as they recover from that initial shock, reorganize, push back, and the German army will now spend the rest of the war in the defense, fighting delaying actions and bracing for what Phil mentioned, the onslaught of fresh American troops, 10,000 per day, roughly a division every single day. Back to you, Phil.
Yeah, question with regards what happened after Brest-Litovsk and the numbers that were left in the east. Was that because they felt that somewhere that the Russian army was going to reinvent itself, or that politically the communists would decide on a different course?
It's a good question, Phil. In my readings and research, which I need to do a bit more, they weren't going to leave the entire Eastern Front devoid of any troops whatsoever. There was still, obviously, some of that concern as well, with the tinderbox that Eastern Europe is, that they felt that there was going to be a considerable need for some type of presence there. And to move everything to the west and then try to transport it to the east again, I think would have been chaotic, to say the least.
Right. And secondly, just to go back and talk about this whole, stormtroop technique. My understanding, you can maybe, if you want to flesh it out, my understanding is, whereas before there was always great consideration given to making sure that one's flanks were not up in the air or open, that now we're saying to troops, drive forward, go around strong points. The follow-up troops will take care of those. They'll clean those up. Don't worry about your flanks. Keep driving forward in an effort to throw the enemy into a state of confusion and open up, I guess, an avenue or a wedge through which we'll be able to get the cavalry or the tanks. Roughly, is that kind of how you see this stormtroop technique?
Very much, and it's more focused on smaller, more agile type tactics, rather than the massed onslaught of infantry just walking across no man's land. It's probably picking selective points, understanding where those weaknesses are through prisoners of war, scouting, reconnaissance, and then exploiting those breakthroughs with additional troops. So rather than just doing that blunt force against the front line, you're looking at a more surgical opening of avenues. Exactly.
Which I think led the Allies to believe that a tank attack, which they employed at Cambrai, something completely new, might stand a chance of breaking the enemy lines and bringing success.
Absolutely. The tank as a breakthrough weapon was, I think part and parcel with the German success in the Second War. Punch the hole, exploit the opening, and then the infantry following behind can mop up and take care of pockets of resistance. Exactly.
Okay, and so the Kaiserschlacht brings, as Carl was saying, heady advances. The Germans get to within 70 kilometers of Paris. They start to shell the city. In Germany, a national holiday is declared to celebrate what they thought would be a victorious end of the war, as did the Allies. And now, it's now that Haig, who has now been promoted to Field Marshal, issues his famous backs to the wall order of the day on the 11th of April. There is no other course but for us to fight it out. Every position must be held to the last man. With our backs to the wall and believing in the justice of our cause, each one of us must fight on to the end. The safety of our homes and the freedom of mankind alike depend upon the conduct of each one of us at this critical moment. In other words, each man is to hold his position. No further retreat will be countenanced, but ultimately, it was not simply the resilience of the Allied armies that saved the day. True for the Germans, longer supply lines caused a slowing down of their advance. But one of the culprits, and I say one of the culprits that brought them to a standstill, was booze. In driving the Allies back, the Germans had overrun the vast Allied supply depots, which the German soldiers broke open to find warehouses full of food and stores of quality they had not seen for years. And so the German propaganda myth that the British were starving too was, in the army, among the soldiers, blown sky high. And this shook the morale of the German soldiers, who now started preferring to loot and drink rather than fight. And so, inebriated to the point of unconsciousness, they could not be aroused by their commanders to battle. And that's a quote. And the German offensive peters out. Now, in preparing this webcast, Carl and I have been chatting, and Carl resists the notion that alcohol is or was a key component in the lack of offensive drive being exhibited by the German army once it got to, for instance, Albert. And so I think that's an important discussion to have. So I'm going to throw it back to you, Carl.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And we've had some great dialogue on that, Phil. And originally when we've done these briefs, I would see the characterization, and whether it's national pride, whether it's misguided history, whether it's, whatever it is, my position, I did initially balk to, at the suggestion that the entire German offensive comes to a halt because of booze. I'm always one to avoid those grand sweeping generalizations.
That I make.
That many a historian make when it comes to the German army. Their tanks were awful, they were drunk, but anyways, the nice thing about this is it allowed us to do a much deeper dive and to understand that. And you and I went back with some sources that you found, and I even found some sources. One of the items I found was, it's called Images of War 1918, the German Offensive by John Sheen. He does make mention of the fact that alcohol provisions, this wealth and bounty that the Germans find in the Allied stores, does cause some of those units to, stop doing it. So I think there's a distinction to be made that did this occur? Absolutely. Were there units that would just simply get in there and slow down and be consumed? I acknowledge that. Did this cause, all the divisions, the 30 to 40 divisions involved in the attack to stop and cause the Kaiserschlacht to peter out? I prefer to say no, because I just don't think on that magnitude for a couple of reasons. One, that presupposes the amount of food and booze, so to speak, available in these supply dumps could sustain 300,000 men, which maybe that's the case. What I've seen in the Sheen book is numerous supply dumps being burned by the French and British before they retreated. So I think that does couch the claim a little bit, that this impacted the advancing German divisions to the extent that it peters out, which from a military perspective, that makes sense to me, that I would destroy almost in a scorched earth policy, as I didn't leave anything for the advancing troops. So I've since moved from my initial resistance to the position a couple of years ago, but it's through great dialogue and research like this that we're able to understand, a different perspective, and that's all you'll get out of me, Phil.
And there you go. And on that very accommodating note, it's time for our refill break.
Cheers.
What we've been talking about, alcohol and sexually transmitted diseases. They've always been the bane of armies. To quote from Napoleonic times, armies march on their stomachs. So food and women and booze, very, very important to the fighting man. Here in Canada, as far back as 1803, when the British Army was, if you like, the national force. I'm going to quote 1803. The commissary at Fort Erie reported one incident of theft by a detachment of the 49th Regiment transporting barrels of rum up the Niagara River. When they arrived here, Morgan and every man in the boat were in liquor. One man was so drunk that he could not stand. 1803. In a recent U.S. study entitled Alcohol and Stress in the Military, dated 2012, it states, these data indicate that each year, excessive alcohol use results in 10,400 active duty military personnel being unable to deploy. Now, Winston Churchill certainly enjoyed a tipple or two. There's the famous confrontation between himself and Lady Astor in the House of Commons when she bitingly charges, "You, Mr. Churchill, are drunk," to which he famously responds, "And you, madam, are ugly, but tomorrow I'll be sober." But on a more serious note, in the First War, the French armies mutinied. How did the authorities induce the men to come back and fight? More booze. Early in the war, the daily ration per soldier was 1/4 of a liter of wine. Later, this was raised to 1/2 liter. And after the mutinies, this was raised again to 3/4 of a liter of wine a day. And if the soldiers could afford it, meaning probably the officer class, they could buy as much as they needed. And so my feeling is that whether we're talking about wine for the Roman legions, or gin and rum for the British soldiers in the colonies, or whiskey during the American Civil War, or vodka for the Red Army during World War II, alcohol has always been an important issue in combat. And I see no reason to believe, and I don't want to reopen the conversation, but I see no reason to believe the German army was less capable of succumbing to alcohol than any other. Peter Simpkins, in his book World War I, refers to the predilection of German troops to hang back near the newly overran storage depots. Martin Middlebrook, in his book The Kaiser's Battle, says the same. And then there's this quote from a German Captain Rudolf Binding, which I actually want to read. So give you a chance to change my glasses.
Objection, Your Honor. New evidence being suggested that was not on the docket before.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. So Binder writes, and this is in John Tremaine's book, To Win a War, deals specifically with 1918. He writes, today the advance of our infantry suddenly stopped near Albert. Nobody could understand why. Our airmen had reported no enemy between Albert and Amiens. Now, if they take Amiens, could win the war. The enemy's guns were only firing now and again on the very edge of affairs. So I jumped into a car with orders to find out what was causing the stoppage. I took a sharp turn with the car into Albert. As soon as I got near the town, I began to see curious sights. Strange figures who looked very little like soldiers, certainly showed no signs of advancing, were making their way back. Men carrying a bottle of wine under their arm and another one open in their hand. Men who could hardly walk. When I got into the town, the streets were running with wine. This is a German officer that I'm quoting. Out of a cellar came a lieutenant of the 2nd Marine Division, helpless and in despair. I asked him what's going to happen. It was essential for them to get forward immediately. He replied solemnly and emphatically, I cannot get my men out of this cellar without bloodshed. When I insisted, he invited me to try my hand. But it was no business of mine, and I saw too that I could have done no more than he. I drove back to divisional headquarters with a fearful impression of the situation. And so, obviously Carl and I will agree to disagree, and we'll, as we always do, meet somewhere in the middle. But we do agree that the offensive grinds to a halt. And this was just the pause that the Allies needed. It took time to make good the losses in arms and equipment. But then in early August 1918, the Canadians, again, because of our success, were transported under cover of darkness from the Vimy Ridge Arras area where they were, and they were instilled or inserted into the line here near Amiens. This was a massive operation, this movement of men, that had to be conducted with the strictest of secrecy because, as I said before, if German intelligence was to glean the presence of the Canadian Corps, then the cat would be out of the bag. They would know exactly where the next offensive operation was coming, and they would move reinforcements to meet it. So, moving only at night, and with 2 brigades left behind to create false radio transmissions, 100,000 men were moved secretly 75 kilometers south. And on the evening before the battle, were slipped into the front line under cover of darkness. It was brilliant. The Germans never knew, never even guessed. And so now Canada's 100 Days Offensive, the final campaign to end the First War, begins at Canal, 8th of August, 1918, or at Amiens, I should say. At 4:20 a.m. on August the 8th, 1918, 2,000 artillery pieces ranged along the Allied front fire almost at one. On the Canadian sector, about 9 kilometers in width, 646 guns are firing in support of the Corps' assault. A great white light went up, and our guns started firing, recounts D.J. Pierce of the Princess Patricia Canadian Light Infantry. The whole German trench rose up in the air with everything in it. The barrage moved forward quickly, reflecting the High Command's hope for a rapid advance. The infantry and tanks, 580 of them, storm over and through smoking craters, shredded barbed wire and dead Germans. By 10 a.m., Guillaucourt, you can see it on your map, was taken. From above, the RAF in their flimsy canvas-colored biplanes, Sopwith Camels, Bristols, Spads, bombed and machine-gunned enemy positions. Raymond Collishaw, a native of Nanaimo, British Columbia, one of the highest-ranking aces of the war with 60 victories, describes the scene. The whole Roy Road was strewn with hundreds of aircraft and derelict tanks. The pilots could see the aeroplane graveyard beneath them, and one was conscious while passing through a hail of fire that at any moment the frail shell in which the pilot felt precariously poised might join its kind below. In addition, 342 new Mark V tanks would help the Canadian Corps stage one of the biggest advances of the war. Machine guns were everywhere, Lance Corporal Ken Foster in the 2nd Battalion wrote. But fortunately for us, the tanks soon put them out of action. Without the tanks, I'm afraid it would have been a hopeless task. By the 4th day of battle, only 38 Mark Vs were still operable. The rest knocked out or broken down. And this is going to have a knock-on effect, as we shall see in the next webcast. But by nightfall, the Canadians had advanced 13 kilometers. The German General Ludendorff, commanding officer, most senior officer on the Western Front, lamented, August the 8th was the black day of the German army. All of the Canadian planned objectives had been met, except Le Canal. It was the only planned objective that did not fall on August the 8th, but it would fall the following day. But the continuation of the offensive was fraught with difficulties. The men were exhausted. Bringing up the heavy guns was difficult. The Germans knew where the Canadians were. They rushed reinforcements to the area who dug in. Still, the Canadians could not be stopped. And in the face of dogged defense, they advanced another 6 kilometers. It was nothing less than astonishing. No other national force came anywhere near what the Canadians had done. But slowly, it becomes clear the hope of a breakthrough, they're dissolving. To continue fighting, remarks one of Currie's brigadiers, will break the spirit of our men. And so finally, with artillery running short of shells, having lost more than half the tanks, Currie appeals to Haig to call off the battle. I quote him, before his corps was pounded to pieces. And so finally, on the 14th of August, the offensive is closed down. But it was the beginning of what has become known as the 100 Days Offensive, the final 100 days of the war. It had been costly. Broken men lay everywhere. The primary dressing stations had been overrun with casualties. At one point, there were over 40 light rail cars filled with bleeding men with nowhere to take them. There were not enough doctors, not enough orderlies to keep up. The secrecy of the move from Vimy had meant inadequate medical preparations, and the incredible success of the frontline troops meant that the wounded were far forward of their medical facilities. I'm just going to throw it over to Carl now, just so he can reflect on what was happening on the Axis side now.
Thanks, Phil. So, opposite the Canadians, we're looking at the Second Army, commanded by von der Marwitz. He's got 6 divisions in the line, including one of these stormtroop divisions, so one of these elite units. He only has 2 in reserve, so anyone who's a student of the military, even a casual one, knows that your reserve element gives you a lot of flexibility, and if you don't have much in the reserve, your ability to stem the flow, stop the bleeding, so to speak, is going to be challenged, to say the least. It's interesting to note Marwitz does not consider his sector to be a likely objective. So the obfuscation, the secrecy which the Canadians do everything, and the overall planning of the objective of the battle is quite well done, because Marwitz thinks he's in a quiet, von der Marwitz thinks he's in a quiet sector. What happens though is as I did a bit of research on this, I noticed that in the weeks leading up to the battle, one of the German divisions in the Second Army, the 27th Division, actually attacks 2 days before into the area in the Somme, which causes some of the concern around the Entente commands. Now, I just want to pause there because Phil and I have been using different terms. We've been using the Entente, we've been using the Allies. And I think it's what we're trying to say is that in World War I, Britain, France, Canada, they were known as the Entente, whereas Germany, Austro-Hungary, Turkey were known as the Austro-Hungarian or the Central Powers. So just in case there's anyone out there that might, want to flag that confusion. So going back, the German 27th Division, 2 days prior to this offensive, they actually launch an attack into the Somme area, and the Entente command say, uh-oh, something's up. They know what's going on. But this is just a regular attack. This is, typical of kind of the back and forth, the ebb and flow of battle. But what this does is it puts the German on a higher level of alert, higher than they would be before, not because they knew something was coming, but because they were expecting a retaliation from that previous attack. So the alert level is ratcheted up somewhat, but as Phil's outlined, it didn't make a difference as the Canadians were, excellent in their execution, from top to bottom. So alert or not, the movement of, the men, more specifically, up to 580 tanks is kept secret and is an incredible feat, and the Germans aren't prepared for this. German losses on the first day totaled 30,000 men. And as Phil mentioned, General Ludendorff utters his famous quote, and I'm going to say it in German just to take a little bit of the glory back from Phil. Der 8. August ist der schwarze Tag des deutschen Heeres in der Geschichte dieses Kriegs. Apologies to German speakers out there, but essentially the 8th of August is the black day of the German army in the history of this war. Ludendorff utters this, not so much from the losses and the reversals on the field, but the rock bottom morale of the troops. And he knows this is the end. The chance for victory is lost for Germany, and now the focus is on securing an acceptable defeat. Phil?
Yeah, and one has to feel for them. 10 Victoria Crosses are awarded, but over 11,000 casualties are suffered. Reinforcements are brought up, and the Canadian Corps is very quickly back to strength again. They were removed from the line in Amiens and were transported north to be front and center for the next stage of the offensive. I think this is the beginning of the end, wrote Private George Anderson to his mother. The Kaiser and his mob will be driven to the farthest end of hell. And driven they would be, but not before some hard-pounding warfare. So why had this initial stage of the final campaign be so successful? 2 words, innovation and learning. The stormtroop tactics, the use for the first time of older tanks as armored personnel carriers. So some could carry a section of troops or supplies inside, others could put soldiers on top and move them forward. The mounting of heavy machine guns on the backs of trucks, providing mobile and heavy firepower. And I'm going to be chatting about this innovation in our next webcast. But mainly, the Canadian Corps didn't suffer from the class rigidity of Haig's command. And this is something we're going to chat about over the next few webcasts and see how the Canadian Corps grow and mature over the next few days. Our men were treated like men. And our Canadian boys caused the Kaiser, the same Kaiser who, upon hearing about the massive convoy of Canadians that had arrived to support King and Country in 1914, had arrived, they will go home in rowboats, now says in Berlin, viewing Amiens, we have reached the limits of our capacity. This war must be terminated. Back to you, John.
All right, thanks, guys. We hope you enjoyed that little chat, the first of our series of little webcasts regarding the beginning of the end, as Phil just said, of World War I and Canada's 100 days. As always, if you liked our little chat, give us a thumbs up. We like to hear the bell ring. And of course, we always encourage you to subscribe and keep track of what we're doing here at the Wobbly Historians. If you have questions or comments, we'll keep those open for a few days. Be sure to give us some feedback. We welcome that as always. As Phil mentioned at the beginning, look down in the show notes for a reference list, some of the material that's been referenced in this webcast. We always try to keep you informed. There will be some good material there that you might want to dig into and look a little bit deeper for yourself. And as always, great time now to head over to our website at liberationtours.ca and check out what we're all about, client testimonials, tours that we have coming up in the future, and hopefully you'll join us on one of these great trips, including the very specific places we're talking about in this webcast series, which we touch on in our Armistice tour every fall. And that's it for this edition of the Wobbly Historians. Thanks for watching.